Tonight is our second of the 4 presentations, and for the first time we are doing it, the presentations, we are now, I believe, Nihal, in our 11th year, and only God is perfect, so you missed only one session, and that was to have a baby. So she's back with us. The topic that we have been exploring is one in which there is some controversy and action within our society, really of sexuality, faith, and respect. As I understand it, my Arabic is minuscule. As I understand it, the word ikhlas in Arabic means purity, as in one of the surahs in the Quran. And it means also purity of intention as well as purity in conduct. Keep that in mind because it's sometimes used as the word for respect, that there is a kind of pure motivation and a pure way of living with one another. And that's one of the points of our series, to see how with our resources of our faith we can really address one another and even our society. First speaker for this evening is no stranger in that Shelley Drozd is a person who suffered under me, was a student in a couple of classes, and as a result, she graduated with high honors, right, and as a religion major from Moravian College with it. She has gone on to be a freelance writer and editor. She specializes in matters concerning higher education particularly, and health communications. She currently is working with Lehigh University Hillel Society with the Jewish students who show up there, usually for dinner, I understand. That's from another circuit that I know that with it. And also at Muhlenberg College in the Office of Communications. And her ambition is to be a chaplain and hopes to enter clinical pastoral education in the course in 2019 with it. She's been active in her Reform congregation, and both in the Lehigh Valley, we have had classes go to at least one of the synagogues as well, and also her home congregation in New Jersey. She's also a Jewish musician, and I have seen her play along at Friday evening services. She's a song leader, music teacher, and a volunteer in social justice. And she tells me that should do it. So, over to you, Shelley.
Anyway, thank you, Walter. I'm honored to be here, and I certainly hope I do justice to that fine education I got at Moravian, and above all, to the mission of this program that's brought us all here today. Towards that end, I want to say that I'm sure we can agree that no one person can represent the entirety of a faith tradition. I'm here because I believe in the urgency of interfaith dialogue, and I'm happy to contribute to it when I can. And also because Walter twisted my arm, but I'm really glad to be here. Truly, Okay, so by way of introduction, first a bit of my Jewish background. I think it offers a good starting point for our topic today. So I was born Shelley Ellen Glazer. My Jewish name is Sarah Esther Bat Pesach V'Pesha Golda. That essentially means I'm Paul and Paula's daughter. I come from a long line of Glazers who arrived in this country from Latvia in the late 1800s. After pushing a cart of dry goods around New Jersey in the countryside for a while, my great-grandfather Sockney sent for his bride from the old country, settled in Raritan, and bought a store. His son David, my grandfather, would marry Rebecca Bloom, who also arrived from the old country, and together they would have 10 children who would keep that store and household operating for more than 100 years. My grandmother was pregnant for the large part of 20 years. The first 6 pregnancies resulted in single births. The last 2 pregnancies resulted in 2 sets of boy-girl twins. All told, there were 5 girls and 5 boys. Then, as my father's sister liked to tell it, the lady doctor came to town, and after that, the birth rate dropped like a rock. So my father, who was the boy in the oldest set of twins, was raised in an observant, paternalistic Jewish household. My aunt and my bubby, that's a Jewish grandmother, they kept a kosher kitchen, they kept Shabbat and all the holidays. The oldest girls basically raised the young children. For their part, the boys came to the table and ate, they helped run the store, and they studied with the rabbi who came to the house to give them their religious training and their bar mitzvah lessons. Because there were so many sons, it was just easier for the rabbi to come to them. And my father would tell me he would break out in the cold sweat every time the rabbi came. But there were no bat mitzvahs for the girls back then. The idea was unheard of at the turn of the 20th century in an Orthodox-leaning conservative family. That mindset even pervaded my own, far more relaxed, conservative Jewish upbringing. I've yet to have my own bat mitzvah, which you may know typically takes place at around the age of 13. So by that standard, I'm a little overdue. My parents only thought to take me to Hebrew school when it was my younger brother's turn to go. I was in the 3rd grade by then, and far too behind my peers to catch up. But I've learned my lessons over the years, and having a bat mitzvah is currently at the top of my bat mitzvah list. I hope to do that soon, and I'll probably do it with a group of women whose own family stories mirror my own. That's a lot of us. It's a generational thing. 2 of my aunts and 2 of my uncles never married because they never found Jews to marry. The small town in which my great-grandfather and his brothers settled was provincial and overwhelmingly Catholic. Like everyone else who arrived in town then, we were an immigrant family, back in the days when everybody was warmly welcomed, able and allowed to prosper and give back to the community. Looking back, sitting on the shoe bench in that store with my dad was my first introduction to interfaith dialogue. Even so, it still wasn't easy for my aunts and uncles to meet other Jews, much less get to the city where most of them were. Nor would they dare marry out of the faith. Their parents unequivocally forbade it. Family legend has it that one uncle fell in love with a beautiful Italian girl and wanted to marry her. The union, his parents warned, would cost him his relationship with his own family and his inheritance. Worse, they would sit Shiva over him. Shiva, you may know, is the traditional 7-day mourning period that takes place after a Jew dies. In other words, he would be good as dead to his family. That Uncle Jake of mine lived to be 92, and he never married. Fast forward to teenage me. Whenever I would meet a new boy, my conversation with my father would go something like this. Dad would say, "Is he Jewish?" My usual answer, "No." And when I got older, and a relationship with a Catholic boy grew in length and seriousness, my father would warn me that it's okay to date him, but not to marry him. Well, my dad died when I was 19. That was 7 years before I would marry a lapsed Catholic. When I went with great trepidation to tell my Glazer family the news of my engagement, they surprised me. They said it was hard enough to find happiness in the world, and I should take my chance to have it. Modernity and loneliness, it seemed, had left its mark on them. One rabbi I went to see in hopes of finding one to conduct an interfaith wedding ceremony told me these marriages never work out. Well, my marriage has not worked out for 33 years. Statistics prove we're in good company. A few years ago, the Pew Research Center conducted a landmark survey on American Jewry. It found, unsurprisingly, that intermarriage is practically non-existent among Orthodox Jews. 98% of married Orthodox Jews in the survey have a Jewish spouse. But among all other married Jews, only half say they have a Jewish spouse. In addition, the survey found that intermarriage rates appear to have risen substantially in recent decades, though they have gotten relatively stable since the mid-1990s. Looking just at non-Orthodox Jews who have gotten married since 2000, 28% have a Jewish spouse, and fully 72% are intermarried. This reflects my own travels through Reform Judaism, which I joined when I married, leaving behind that very non-strict yet conservative upbringing, only to find that philosophically, Reform Judaism was where I had always belonged. So it was a very lucky thing. In the Reformed congregations my family has belonged to over the years, we were far more likely to meet interfaith families like ours than families with two Jewish parents. I consider this inclusiveness one of Reformed Judaism's greatest strengths and goes a long way to explain why it's the largest Jewish denomination in America. In my heart of hearts, I know that my dad would have struggled with the fact my husband wasn't Jewish. I also have no doubt, and my mother confirms this, that Dad would have valued my husband Joe for the good man he is, and would have accepted him into the family with unconditional love. It helps that Joe was willing to raise Jewish children. This was important to me, as Joe's own faith continues to be to this day. Our children would turn out to be just one daughter, Rebecca, named after my bubby, and spelled with a K-A-H like the Jewish matriarch. I have no memory of my bubby. And I often wonder how she would feel about this child of an interfaith marriage named to honor her memory. I honestly don't know if she would have renounced me for marrying out of the faith, as did the vast majority of my cousins, who coincidentally happened to be a generation of 5 boys and 5 girls, but no twins. By the way, our Rebecca did terrifically at her bat mitzvah and her confirmation, and is herself marrying a wonderful young man with Unitarian leanings in a Jewish wedding this November. And while my Glazer aunts and uncles were still with us, which was a long time, most of them lived into their 90s, one even reached 100, they delighted greatly in their Jewish grandniece and her father. So these are just some of the formative and transformative experiences that created the Jew that stands before you today. From here, I'd kind of like to switch direction and share with you some modern voices speaking out on the current dynamics between men and women in Judaism. So who is a Jew anyway? Here's one answer on Jewish demographics provided by the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. It is estimated that there are around 15 million Jews worldwide, about 0.2% of the global population. The 2 millennia Jewish diaspora led to the formation of separate ethnic communities with a shared tradition but distinct practices. German-descended Ashkenazi Jews, that's me, comprise over 75% of the world's Jewish population. And Iberian-descended Sephardic Jews comprise up to 20%. As I said earlier, Reform Judaism is the largest denomination of American Jews, about 38%. Conservative Judaism is the second largest U.S. denomination, about 33%, and Orthodox Judaism comes in third at 22%. How we all got here, in a far more elemental sense, is obviously through our sexuality. And Judaism has a lot to say on that matter. George Robinson, in his book Essential Judaism, writes the following. Like almost all the other major world religions, Judaism has a complex set of laws governing human sexuality. However, in one major respect, the Jewish attitude towards sexuality is unique. It wholeheartedly approves of sex and sexual pleasure. Not sex is an unfortunate but necessary way of continuing the species, but sex is a holy experience, a mitzvah, a commandment. Pleasure, like our sexual organs, is a gift from the Creator, who created all things in accordance with his wisdom. The Talmud specifically states that, quote, a person will be held accountable to God for refusing to enjoy those pleasures that are permitted. The great medieval philosopher Maimonides called such a person a sinner. So clearly, celibacy and self-denial are not on the Jewish agenda. However, free love doesn't make it there either, nor does prostitution, rape, or incest. Sex should not involve the exploitation, coercion, or subjugation of another person. Traditional Judaism believes in sex and sexual pleasure as an important part of marriage. A husband is supposed to make sure that his wife enjoys sexual intercourse. It is also essential that sex integrates both the bodily urges and the emotions, that it should personalize the impersonal. Emotional commitment and sex are not mutually exclusive. Hence the emphasis on marriage as a prerequisite to sex and the prohibition on illicit sexual activity. However, Robinson continues, the rabbis were not fools. They were married men themselves. Maimonides writes that, quote, no prohibition in all the Torah is as difficult to keep as that of forbidden unions and illicit sexual relations. We recognize that humans are fallible, but one has to wonder how we got to this place where sexual immorality has become almost normative. Witness Bill Cosby, Harvey Weinstein, and their ilk, and what we've learned about the dangers of women alone in their presence. Reflecting on the Weinstein fallout in the Jewish magazine, fallout in the Jewish magazine The Forward, reporter Avital Chitzik Goldschmidt provides an orthodox reflection on the concept of yichud, the Jewish laws forbidding an unrelated man and woman to be in seclusion together. She recalls her high school teacher, a long-bearded rabbi who spent weeks of class time focusing on every configuration, every scenario in which a man and woman might find themselves alone. The high school juniors in her class didn't understand why the rabbi was so obsessed with this topic. Years later, Chitzik Goldschmidt learned that her former teacher worked as a counselor for sexual abuse victims in ultra-Orthodox communities. Suddenly, the rabbi's insistence all made sense to her. The concept of yichud acts like a fence that protects sexual contact. For the rabbis of the Talmud, seclusion was almost synonymous with intimacy. Indeed, the first steps of a traditional Jewish bride and groom after they're married under the chuppah are to go in the yichud room. It's a room of seclusion where they are now permitted to be alone as husband and wife. It is the ultimate symbol of marriage. What was once forbidden is now permitted and celebrated. These laws were probably rooted in a Talmudic view of women as objects of temptation, laws intended to protect men from sin as much as women from assault, in a time when a woman's purity and thus honor were everything. Where today some see these laws as irrelevant and misogynist, Chitzik Goldschmidt suggests that we reread yichud as a mandate for personal space. Perhaps, she says, it's time to acknowledge the darkest corners of the sexual psyche and how they affect our social interactions, something that many Americans today recognize. Excuse me. Whatever its original meaning may have been, yichud today has the potential to serve as a powerful tool for women to cope with the realities of a Harvey Weinstein world. Demand that others be present. Protect your personal space. Chitzik Goldschmidt says this is especially true for Orthodox young women who are often particularly vulnerable in the face of male authority. But all young women should be able to voice their demands for a safe space with confidence. In the end, she says, religion neither protects victims nor prevents perpetrators.
Abuse, assault, and harassment, as we all well know, can happen to anyone and everyone, women as well as to men. Judith Plasko is a Jewish feminist theologian and professor emerita of religion studies at Manhattan College. She sees the Jewish woman's problem through a decidedly different lens. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that. For all Jews, entry into the covenant at Sinai is the root experience of Judaism, that central event that establishes the Jewish people. These are just some, I'm sorry, wrong page. Given the importance of this event, there can be no verse in the Torah more disturbing to the feminists than Moses' warning to his people in Exodus 19:15. Quote, "Be ready for the third day. Do not go near a woman." For here, at this very moment that the Jewish people stand at Sinai, ready to receive the covenant, not now the covenant with individual patriarchs, but with the people as a whole, Moses addresses the community only as men. In this passage, Plasko continues, the otherness of women finds its way into the very center of Jewish experience. And although the verse can hardly be blamed for women's situation, it sets forth a pattern recapitulated again and again in Jewish sources. Women's invisibility at the moment of entry into the covenant is reflected in the content of the covenant, which, in both grammar and substance, addresses the community as male heads of the household. It is perpetuated by the later tradition, which in its comments and codifications takes women as objects of concern or legislation, but rarely sees them as shapers of tradition and actors in their own lives. Plasko asks, if women are invisible from the first moment of Jewish history, can we hope to become visible now? And lastly, Rabbi Ethan Witkowski is a rabbi at Park Avenue Synagogue in Manhattan. His advice to Jewish men to help end what he calls rape culture is to emulate the patriarch Abraham. I feel his message is most powerfully read in the first person. Rabbi Witkowski writes, at the height of the Me Too movement in October 2017. As I read through the growing stream of Me Too posts last week, I was among the many men unsure of how to respond. The experiences behind each post describing sexual harassment, some horrific, others horrifically commonplace, reflect a state of our culture that must reckon with how we allow men to treat women. Lest we be led to think that this isn't a problem in the Jewish community, there is increasing evidence, statistical and anecdotal, to suggest that this is very much our problem. The rabbi continues. In reading the stories shared, I began to examine my own behavior towards women. I try to be aware of gender dynamics in my relationships and the world around me. I try to note how much space I am taking up physically and verbally. And yet, in this case, as in most, right action alone isn't enough. I must also ask about the larger picture. How have I worked to address societal causes at play? The answer, I am forced to admit, is that while I may personally act appropriately, I don't do enough to help change the system of which I am part. One need only consider Abraham and Noah to know that as Jews, moral culpability is never measured merely by way of guilt for a deed done, but also by the degree to which we are complicit in enabling the existence of a society in which sinful deeds occur. Noah is called righteous, blameless in his generation. The qualifying words, in his generation, are understood by the rabbis to suggest that Noah is only considered righteous relative to his sinful neighbors. Compared to someone like Abraham, whose righteousness is textually unquestioned, Noah is just a regular person. Abraham's superior moral stature, though not without flaw,
is illustrated best by his actions toward others. When God came to Noah announcing the coming destruction, Noah acquiesces immediately and builds his ark. When God informs Abraham that Sodom and Gomorrah were to be destroyed, Abraham argues with God and tries to save the cities. These two men embody two paradigms of righteousness. Rabbi goes on, as a man, I am also forced to admit that it is easy to escape from this uncomfortable conversation. I have an arc of masculinity into which I can hide, and when talk of gender and privilege and power relationships get to be a little too much for me, like Noah, I can hop into that boat, secure that I will be safe from the rains pouring down on others. I haven't done this intentionally, nor have the other men I know, but we have done it. We are able to live comfortably in the world in a way which I am told women are not. There's no question that it's better to be neutral rather than to be part of the problem. Noah was, after all, still called righteous. But as Jews, we must ask, how can we become Abrahams? How do we fight to save the cities and change the way of the sinners? How do we reach a level of righteousness that is unqualified because it is inclusive? Here are Rabbi Witkowski's proposed solutions. For starters, as men, we can watch our behavior and the behavior of those around us. If you see something, say something. If humor is inappropriate, you see unwanted touch, speak up. Be polite, be a mensch, that's a decent person, but be an Abraham. It might be awkward, but this is important. If we all did just that, perhaps we could prevent the next generation of women from having to say me too. We should also educate our children to grow up into the upstanders we want them to be. We are not born with a gender imbalance. We grow into it. We can think about the symbols, styles, and language we use when we speak to our children. Furthermore, we can elevate the voices of the women, both ancient and contemporary, in our lives. They haven't been heard from enough. Our matriarchs have been maligned, abused, coerced, bought, sold, cast out, mocked, and those are just the ones we know about. Most of the women in our tradition are voiceless. Many are not even given names. Noah's wife is simply known as Eshet Noah, the wife of Noah. Her voice has been lost along with countless women over the ages. These are the voices that must be heard. We have come a long way in how we think about gender, but most of that work has been done by women. Women have defined and redefined the feminine and feminism of our society, and it is now time for men to be intentional and evolve away from a toxic masculinity. Masculine shouldn't be defined by domination, control, and how much power we have. Like Abraham himself, we do have great power, and we should leverage that power to speak up for the humanity and equality of everyone. Finally, on the subject of sexual harassment, it may not be in our willingness to speak out, but rather our willingness to listen that will be the truest test of our ability to heed the calling of the hour. If there is one lesson of these Torah teachings, it is that moral behavior, despite the naysayers, can improve. In 10 generations, from Cain to Noah, we produced a person who achieved a respectable degree of righteous. 10 generations later, Abraham raised our expectations of righteous behavior to a whole different level. It has been more than 10 generations since Abraham, and it is time to evolve again. As Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel taught, some may be guilty, but all are responsible for the ills of our world. May we, no matter our gender, assume our Abrahamic obligations and push the moral arc of our universe closer to justice. And on that note, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind attention.
Salam and shalom, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce my friend and partner in interfaith work. I didn't receive your bio, so I'm going to read whatever I got online. I hope it's accurate. I'm just going to read the abridged version. Rabbi Brian Michelson has been serving Oheb Shalom Reform congregations since 1998. He's a graduate of Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, PA, earned his master's degree in 1990, and was ordained in 1992 at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, Ohio. Before joining RCOS, he served for 6 years as a rabbi for Temple Beth Israel in Melbourne, Australia. He began teaching religious school at 16, and his passion for the classroom with the student of all ages has not changed. And I can testify to that. He is also my teacher of Judaism. Whatever I know of Judaism, I have learned from Rabbi Brian. Please welcome Rabbi.
So I can make this really short and say Shelley said it all and I'm done. But I will add just a few bits. As it is an honor, thank you, Rabina, for inviting me. I have to, she's a very hard person to say no to. Any of those of you who have worked with her know that she will keep at you until you finally do say yes. And so I appreciate being thought of, and I was told that they wanted somebody from outside the area somebody a little bit different. I grew up within the Reform movement, the liberal arm of Judaism, and I have been working within the Reform rabbinate now in over 25 years, as you heard from my bio. I grew up in what I would refer to as a traditional Reform family. I grew up in New York. My mother was actually a Jewish educator. My father sold, we used to call him the toilet paper salesman. He was a jobber and sold paper goods in New York City. But we grew up in a home where Jewish practice was hugely important, even if it was modified in a Reform liberal sort of a way, meaning that every Friday night we knew as a family that we would be together for dinner to welcome the Sabbath, and that we were expected to go to services afterwards, and that if we were going to do something with friends on a Friday night afterwards, you knew you had to wait until after the Sabbath services before you were going to see anybody. That was simply the expectation. We were going to celebrate all of the holidays. We built the Sukkah, the Feast of Booths. We would build a booth in our backyard and try to eat as many meals as we could outside. But at the same time, I grew up in a family that did not keep the laws of the dietary laws, the laws of kashrut. Now today I do keep them fairly strictly, but when I grew up, the way I describe it is I grew up in a home where if it wasn't nailed down, we ate it. And if it was nailed down, we gnawed on it. But it was one that was full of Jewish tradition and Jewish ritual, but from a fairly liberal point of view. And part of the reason I start off by explaining that is this became the foundation for me and for my basic theology when it came to many of the issues of which we're talking about, and for me as a Jew and for me as a rabbi in terms of the work that I do. The Reform movement, which, as Shelley said, is the largest movement in North America, for many of the things that are hot button issues in terms of things like the ordination of women and the involvement of women, for the Reform movement are very much yesterday's news, because the very first female cantor was invested 55 years ago, and the first female rabbi was ordained 45 years ago. And so women in the Reform movement have had positions of power, authority, leadership within the community for a very long time. So when these issues are coming up and being discussed today, my response has always been there, done that. It is egalitarianism is one of the very foundations of it. And that really makes a very interesting challenge for Judaism, because the language of Judaism is Hebrew. Now, the challenge we have with that is that you say you wish to be egalitarian, but at the same time, you have the Hebrew language, which is a language that only has two genders within the language itself. There is no neuter case. Everything is either masculine or feminine, right? Even more interesting, which as Shelley made a note about, was that when the Torah talks and it speaks to people, whether it is singular or plural, as long as there is one man present, the tradition is that you use the masculine verb. So what does that language say about it? So the question is, one of the things we do now is we struggle with the question of egalitarian language, and how do we say things in a way that is respectful and still reflects the understanding of the ancient text, but at the same time understands that as an ancient language, it only had the two cases, the male and the female, while the English that we use allows us another opportunity to use the neuter or a gender-free language. And it's actually been one of the things the Reform movement has really struggled with in terms of its worship and its prayer, is how do you translate, how do you say some of these prayers in a way that say, we are still saying the same prayer that we have been saying for 3,000 years, yet at the same time recognizing the fact that some of the language may be troubling in terms of the way it presents male and female roles and gender. If I had the answer to that, I'd probably be speaking to a different crew, but it is one of the things that we continue to play with. Sometimes one of the answers that is often given is we'll use the Hebrew, and if we say it in the Hebrew, we don't know that it's necessarily masculine or feminine. I will admit I have a little bit of a problem with that, A, because I understand the Hebrew, and B, I think that's just avoiding the problem, and that we really need to begin to look at some of these things. But let me go back one step further. One of the basic assumptions that Judaism holds, and this is about everyone, is there is a very basic teaching that when God creates humanity at the end of the sixth day of creation, God says, let us make man in our image, let us make them male and female, right? And so from that basic understanding, Judaism teaches the idea that every single person is made in the image of God. Now, when you start off with that concept that every person is made in the image of God, the question is always asked, well, how can we be made in the image of God when, even when you have identical twins, they're not really identical, right? We all look different. Judaism's understanding is that's because the soul within us is what is the part that is made by God, that is given to us by God. And therefore, our basic understanding of the world is we are meant to strive throughout our lives to try and see the God in the other person. All too often today, we have spent so much time making the person that we don't understand the other, right? By no longer looking to see God in their face. What we are challenged by today is really that effort to see the divine in each person, whether they be male, whether they be female, and that when we act and treat and respond to that person, that we treat them with the appropriate respect that somebody made in the image of God should receive. One of the things that Judaism has always traditionally done is it is a belief in terms of the idea of what sometimes people refer to as the golden mean. There are very few things within Judaism that are 100% good and 100% bad. Most of what we live in life is actually somewhere in between, right? If we think about something as simple as food, right? We need food to survive, so food is certainly good. too much of it, right? Gluttony, or can lead to health problems and the like. So is it the food that is good or bad? No, it's what we do with it. It's how we use it, right? And it's the effect that we have. Well, Judaism has this same belief for things like alcohol, but it also talks about it in terms of sexuality and sex itself. Judaism teaches traditionally that there are two urges that we have, that struggle within us. One is called Yetzer HaTov, which is the inclination to do good. It is the part of us that inspires us to want to do the right thing, that gives us satisfaction when we do something, even if nobody else notices that we do it. The other side of that is something that's referred to the Yetzer Hara, literally the evil impulse. The interesting thing about the evil impulse is it's not completely evil, because the evil impulse is part of where our sexuality comes from. Because if we only follow the Yetzer HaTov, if we only follow the impulse to do good and ignore our sexuality, what happens? You end up like the Essenes did in the ancient world, like the Shakers did, like any of the celibate communities do. You die out because you are not bringing on future generations, right? So sex within Jewish tradition is, again, neither good or bad, but it is the way it's expressed and how it is done. Rape is sex in a negative sense. In a loving relationship, it can be seen as good and positive. That it is the battle between these two that is where we live. The way I often explain it is, if you remember the old cartoons, every time a decision had to be made by the characters, a little angel shows up on one shoulder, a little devil shows up on the other shoulder. Both sides whispering in and saying, this is what you should do. Judaism says, in a sense, that is the dialogue we have inside ourselves. That sometimes it's not the thought itself that is sinful, but is what we are measured on, what we are measured by, and what God holds us responsible for are the actions that we take, right? So although it ages me to an extent, I always use the example of after Jimmy Carter finished his term as president, he gave a very famous interview to Playboy magazine. In that interview, he admitted that he had committed adultery in his heart many times, and that from a Christian point of view, he should be held accountable for having done so. From a Jewish perspective, I would say President Carter did nothing wrong. Why? Because to have those urges, those thoughts, that's normal. We can't pretend not to be, we are sexual beings. We can't pretend that that's not there. The difference is, do we have control over the urge, or does the urge have control over us? It is the action that we are held accountable for, not necessarily simply the thought. One of the other things that is really interesting to think about within Jewish tradition is one of the things that was separated the sexes were that there was traditionally this concept of separate but equal kind of status. And there's a wonderful children's book out there that talks about the Brown versus the Board of Education lawsuit, which says separate is never equal. And the idea that we must work together, and so Reform Judaism has attempted to try and make women and men equals. And in fact, if you look within the Reform congregations, the Reform community right now, more women are being ordained as rabbis and as cantors. More of the leadership of congregations and the number of people who show up in congregational life are overwhelmingly women. There's actually been a movement, there's actually some movement right now to try and figure out how do we bring some of the men back. because the women are dominating our congregational life. It's one of those times where you can almost be a victim of some of your success, whereas we have to be careful about some of these things. One of the things that, and for me, I tend to follow. I'm just trying to think about which is the next one. One of the things that I should mention as we talk about this is the changes that I have seen in my own job in the 25 years since I started doing this. We live in a very different world, and it's actually, I find it very scary. The simple fact is that I will now never meet with anybody in my office alone in the building. Right? When we designed the building that we are in right now, we put the glass panels into the doors as the first step. But now we've gotten to the point where I have to make sure there's somebody else in the building with me. Right? That was a change I could never have imagined. Yet at the same time, we do know from what has happened in the Catholic Church and what has happened within synagogues as well, there has been abuse of power, especially by the men, and sexual exploitation, inappropriate working conditions, inappropriate relationships have all been out there and part of the situation. The question is, what do we do? Well, first of all, the simple fact is we need to talk about it. We talk about it on a fairly regular basis, and we actually have started with our teens. There's actually a number of interesting programs that are put out by the Jewish Women International about healthy dating. And we actually make all of our 16-year-old kids go through that program. Why? Because it's about having them talk to each other about what they want from a relationship in a time when they're not actually in a relationship with the person they're acting it out with. To model what is proper behavior. Because if we are not doing it, if we are not modeling it for that generation, then there's no hope for us whatsoever. The other part of it is we need to be the voice to say this is not acceptable. Right? We need to, as a Jewish community, we need to take our head out of the sand. This is a slight parallel. I'll tell the story and explain why. When I was 13, when I had my bar mitzvah, I still remember going to the catering hall with my parents as they were planning for the bar mitzvah. And one of the questions the catering staff there asked was whether they planned on having an open bar or not. Now, I came from a family of not of particularly big drinkers, and they said no. We'll do it kind of on a per person basis. They said that's okay, because even if you did it that way, whenever it's a Jewish function, we only charge them this much for the open bar, whereas when it's the Italians, we charge them this much for the open bar. The assumption was the Italians were going to drink more than the Jews. And from some of these expectations, there was this myth within the Jewish community that we don't have a problem with alcoholism, with drug abuse. And the fact is, oh yes, we do. Our numbers are exactly the same percentage as the rest of the world. But for way too long, people hid the fact that they had these kinds of abuse problems because it was always said, we don't have those problems in our community. So we are doing the same now with issues like domestic violence. A few years back, on one of our main holidays, on Yom Kippur, on the morning of Yom Kippur, I got myself into a great deal of hot water because I gave a sermon on the topic of domestic violence. And then I asked every man in the congregation at the very end of the sermon to stand up and to take a vow to say domestic violence is not something that we can stand by and let happen. You can imagine the storm that would have come after that. How can you on this holy day be talking to us about topics like this and then embarrassing us into standing up and saying something? To which I responded is because we have to. We must be the ones who are saying something because we have to acknowledge that the problem exists in our community too. And it is only by acknowledging that we can begin to work on fixing the problem at all. Because when a woman doesn't feel like this is a synagogue is a safe place for her, is she going to come see her rabbi, whether male or female, to discuss the issues that she's having? Absolutely not. Are the teens going to talk about an uncomfortable situation that they may have been put into where a friend of theirs or someone they know or someone at a party did something inappropriate? Not unless they feel safe. So our job is, at this point in time, really working on beginning to make them feel safe. I am the father of two daughters. Actually, one of them is a junior right now at Muhlenberg, so it was very interesting to talk to Shelley about that. And we have taught them and hope to model for them the way we would want them to live. That their Judaism should be a valid part of their life. It should be something that guides their very being, their soul, in terms of decision making. What is acceptable, what is not acceptable. We also taught them, as one of the very basic values, there is a concept of tikkun olam, repairing the world, which says that when God created the world, a little part was broken, and that God needs our help in order to fix the world. And what that means is it's not something that we say as Jews, we can wait for somebody else to do it for us. We are required to be part of the solution ourselves. And so when it comes to the issues we talk about today, about gender, about safety, about the issues of identity, or anything that deals with anything that can be seen as making somebody else the other, we have an obligation to be part of the solution. It is a basic Jewish value, and one that, if nothing else, I hope is one of the ones that my daughters walk away with, knowing that this is part of who they are